They wanted a servant. They got a reckoning. I stood at the edge of my son's wedding reception, champagne glass trembling in my hand, watching my daughter-in-law lean into the microphone with a smile sharp enough to draw blood. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, her voice dripping with mockery, "I'd like to introduce tonight's special staff member." Every eye in that ballroom turned toward me. My son stood beside her, silent as a grave. "My father-in-law volunteered to serve tables tonight. Isn't that sweet?" Laughter rippled through the crowd like poison spreading through water. She called me a failure. Said I should be grateful they even invited me after what I'd done to this family. The lie tasted like ash in my mouth, but I said nothing. She handed me an apron at my own son's wedding, while 200 guests pulled out their phones to film my humiliation. The live stream chat exploded. "Look at this pathetic old man. Servant at his own son's wedding. What a loser." My son laughed. "My own blood," he laughed. I served champagne to people who wouldn't meet my eyes. I cleared plates while strangers whispered and pointed. And when it was over, when every camera had captured my shame and uploaded it for the world to mock, I walked out in silence. No shouting, no tears. Just the sound of my shoes on marble carrying me toward the exit. They thought they'd broken me. They had no idea what I'd built in the shadows. The next morning, their world collapsed. The bank canceled their mortgage, the one I'd been guaranteeing for 3 years. Their luxury car repossessed by noon. Her boutique padlocked by the county for unpaid liens I'd quietly stopped covering. My phone exploded, 110 missed calls, texts begging, threatening, pleading. "What did you do? You're destroying us. Please, we're sorry, but I wasn't finished." Not even close. Stay with me until the end of this story, because what happens next will leave you breathless. You'll see how a lifetime of silence became the deadliest weapon, how the servant they mocked became the architect of their downfall, and how sometimes the quietest revenge is the one that echoes the loudest. This is the story of how I dismantled everything they stole, piece by piece, smile by smile, until they were begging for the mercy they never showed me. Welcome to my reckoning. My name is William Anderson Bill to anyone who's ever shaken my hand, and at 63 years old I thought I'd seen every shade of human nature. 40 years as an architect taught me that people reveal themselves in what they build, some construct with integrity, others with shortcuts that eventually crumble. I buried my wife Helen 2 years ago, and since then I've lived quietly in the home we built together, tending her rose garden and trying to find purpose in the spaces she left behind. I never imagined my son's wedding would be the day I learned just how badly I'd misjudged the foundation of my own family. The invitation arrived 3 months prior, thick cardstock gold embossing the kind of extravagance that made me wince. Mr. William Anderson was printed in elegant script at the bottom of a long list of names, almost an afterthought. Rachel had planned everything, Ethan assured me over an awkward phone call. "She's got a vision, Dad. Just show up and enjoy yourself." There was something in his voice I couldn't quite place, a tightness that made me wonder if he was trying to convince himself as much as me. I pressed my suit, polished my shoes, and drove 2 hours to Riverside Manor with a check for $10,000 in my jacket pocket, everything I could spare and then some. The moment I stepped into the venue, I knew I didn't belong. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings. Ice sculptures shaped like swans guarded the champagne fountain. Women glittered in designer gowns, while men compared watches that cost more than my monthly pension. I gave my name to a young woman with a clipboard who scanned her list twice before finding me. "Oh, Mr. Anderson, you're at table 18. She pointed toward the back near the swinging kitchen doors. I made my way through the crowd, nodding at faces that looked past me as if I were part of the catering staff. Table 18 was tucked in the corner, partially obscured by a decorative column. My table mates were distant cousins of Rachel's, whom I'd never met, pleasant enough people who made polite conversation about the weather before turning back to their phones. From my seat, I watched Rachel's parents hold court at the head table just below the bride and groom. Her father, a real estate developer whose name I'd seen on billboards, stood and raised his glass. His voice boomed across the room. "To new money meeting old values. May this union bring prosperity to those who know how to seize it." Laughter rippled through the crowd. I didn't understand the joke until I caught the way his eyes flicked briefly toward my corner, a smirk playing at his lips. Old values. Old money. Old man in the back. Throughout the ceremony, I searched for Ethan's eyes, hoping for some acknowledgement, some silent reassurance that I mattered here. He looked everywhere but at me, at Rachel radiant in her white gown, at the photographer, at his shoes. When the officiant asked if anyone objected, I felt a strange impulse to stand, not to stop the wedding, but simply to remind my son I existed. I stayed seated. My hands gripped the edge of the table until my knuckles went white. The reception began with toasts and dancing. I nursed a glass of wine, watching my son spin his bride across the floor, their laughter floating above the music. I thought perhaps the ceremony's coldness had been unintentional, that the reception would bring warmth. Then Rachel took the microphone. The DJ lowered the music. Everyone turned to face her, phones already raised to capture what they assumed would be a tender moment. She smiled, that practiced influencer smile I'd seen in her social media posts, and spoke into sudden silence. "I want to take a moment to recognize someone very special tonight," she began, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "We have a wonderful volunteer joining our staff this evening, my father-in-law, Bill." Confused laughter scattered through the crowd. I felt my chest tighten. She walked toward me, heels clicking on marble, carrying something white and folded. The crowd parted. Phones angled in my direction. She handed me an apron, white fabric with Anderson family help embroidered in gold script across the chest. "We thought it would be nice for you to contribute to the celebration," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "The champagne trays are over there." 200 pairs of eyes fixed on me. The live stream chat on the venue's screens exploded with laughing emojis and mocking comments I could read, even from across the room. My hands shook as I took the apron. Ethan stood frozen beside his bride, his face unreadable, his silence louder than any words. I wanted to refuse to walk out with my dignity intact, but something stopped me. Maybe stubbornness, maybe shock, maybe the faint hope that this was some misguided joke that would end with apologies. I tied the apron around my waist and picked up a tray of champagne flutes. For 45 minutes I served. I cleared plates smudged with lipstick and half-eaten cake. I refilled glasses for guests who didn't say thank you, who whispered and photographed me like I was part of the entertainment. When the knife finally cut through the wedding cake and the crowd cheered, I set down my tray, untied the apron, and folded it carefully over the back of a chair. From my jacket, I pulled out the envelope containing my check. I crossed out the amount, wrote a single line on a fresh piece of paper, and placed it on the gift table among the other envelopes stuffed with cash and well wishes. Support suspended until respect restored. Dad. I walked toward the kitchen exit, my dress shoes clicking against marble, each step carrying me farther from the son I thought I knew and closer to a man I'd have to become. They thought I left defeated. They didn't realize I'd just begun building something new. I drove home through empty highways, my hands steady on the wheel, even as my mind replayed the evening in fragments. The apron, the laughter, Ethan's silence. By the time I pulled into my driveway, dawn was breaking over the roofline of the house Helen and I had designed together all those years ago. That's when I saw it, notifications flooding in from every direction, hundreds of them all tied to Rachel's wedding live stream. My hands hovered over the keyboard as I clicked the first link. The video had already reached 2.3 million views. 2.3 million strangers had watched me serve champagne at my own son's wedding. The title made my stomach turn. Father-in-law serves at son's wedding, cringe or justified. The comments section was a battleground. Some defended me with words like elder abuse and this is heartbreaking, but just as many mocked me with casual cruelty. He looks like he deserves it, one comment read with 12,000 likes. Boomer gets reality check, said another. Maybe he was a terrible dad and this is karma. I scrolled until my eyes burned, unable to look away from the digital dissection of my humiliation. Rachel had shared the clip across every platform she touched. On Instagram, she'd pinned the cruelest comments to the top of her stories, laughing at them with her followers. On TikTok, the video had been remixed with mocking music. On Reddit, entire threads debated whether I'd somehow earned this treatment, strangers crafting narratives about my life based on 90 seconds of footage. My phone buzzed. A text from Ethan, Dad, it was just a joke. Don't be sensitive. Rachel didn't mean anything by it. Call me when you calm down. I stared at those words until they blurred. Calm down. As if humiliation were something you could simply breathe through like a passing storm. I didn't call him. I didn't call anyone. Instead, I watched as Rachel's follower count climbed in real time, thousands of new faces joining her audience every hour. Within 48 hours, she'd transformed my pain into profit. A luxury wine company offered her $15,000 to promote their brand in a post about celebrating family moments. An event planning app paid her $20,000 for a sponsored video about setting boundaries at your wedding. A podcast called Family Dynamics Unfiltered gave her $15,000 to appear as a guest and discuss navigating difficult relatives. $50,000 total. I did the math 3 times, hoping I'd miscounted. She posted a thank you video wearing a designer dress I knew cost more than my monthly pension, her voice syrupy with false gratitude. "Sometimes family teaches you the best lessons," she said, looking directly into the camera. "About boundaries, about knowing your worth, about not letting anyone dim your light." Her followers devoured it. 80,000 new people joined her audience, all of them believing they understood our story based on her carefully edited narrative. Ethan told mutual friends, people who called me hesitant and uncomfortable, that Rachel was just capitalizing on the moment and that I'd get over it eventually. He actually believed that. Or maybe he needed to believe it, because acknowledging the truth would mean confronting what kind of woman he'd married and what kind of son he'd become. I made a decision then, sitting in the kitchen where Helen used to hum while cooking Sunday dinners. I opened my social media accounts one by one, Facebook, Instagram, the LinkedIn profile I barely used, and deleted each of them. Let everyone think I was retreating in shame, a defeated old man crawling into obscurity. But before I closed those accounts, I downloaded the original unedited livestream file. Not the clip Rachel had shared, but the full 90-minute recording that showed everything: her smirk when she handed me the apron, Ethan's frozen complicity, the whispered comments from guests who thought their phones as microphones wouldn't pick up their cruelty. I copied that file onto 3 separate hard drives, labeled each one with the date, and locked them in the fireproof safe where I kept Helen's jewelry and our important documents. Then I drove to Miss Porter's office. Margaret Porter had been Helen's colleague at the university before she'd gone into law, and she'd handled our estate planning after Helen passed. She took one look at my face and poured 2 glasses of whiskey, even though it was barely noon. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, her expression shifting from sympathy to something harder, sharper. "Bill," she said quietly, "do you want legal advice or do you want justice?" I thought about that question for a long moment. "Both," I said. She nodded, took the hard drive I offered, and locked it in her office safe. "Then we start building your case." Quietly. That night, alone in the house that still smelled faintly of Helen's lavender sachets, I opened my phone and played the last voicemail she'd left me. It was recorded a week before she died, her voice already thin with illness, but still carrying that iron certainty I'd loved. "Promise me something, Bill," she said. "Never let them erase who you are. Not for comfort. Not for peace. Not for anything. Promise me." I closed my eyes, felt tears slip down my cheeks, and whispered into the empty room, "I promise." They thought I deleted the video. I only deleted my silence. The week after meeting with Miss Porter, I forced myself into a routine that felt almost normal. I watered Helen's roses, paid bills, organized the basement workshop where decades of blueprints gathered dust. It was during one of these cleaning sessions that I pulled out the accordion file containing financial documents related to Rachel's boutique. I'd co-signed a business loan for her 2 years ago, back when she was still playing the role of loving daughter-in-law, back when she brought me homemade cookies and called me Dad with what seemed like genuine affection. The loan payments had been irregular lately, and I needed to review the terms before my next meeting with Miss Porter. I spread the papers across my workbench, sorting through invoices and bank statements Rachel had returned to me months earlier. That's when I noticed something odd. Inside one of the folders, pressed flat against the interior pocket, was a small rectangular shape wrapped in packing tape. I peeled back the tape carefully and found a USB drive unmarked and slightly worn. My first thought was that it had been accidentally left behind, some forgotten backup of boutique inventory or vendor contacts. But something about the way it had been hidden, deliberately taped into that specific folder, made my instincts prickle. I climbed the basement stairs, carried my laptop to the kitchen table where the light was better, and plugged in the drive. The file directory loaded slowly. One folder appeared titled Estate Planning, Final in all capital letters. My mouth went dry. I hadn't done any estate planning recently beyond what Miss Porter and I had established after Helen's death. My hand hesitated over the mouse before I clicked the folder open. The first document that appeared made my vision narrow: Last Will and Testament of William Anderson, version 3. The date stamp read 2 months ago, right around the time of Ethan's engagement party. I'd never written a third version of anything. My actual will, the legitimate one, filed with Miss Porter, had been finalized a year after Helen passed and hadn't been touched since. I opened the document with hands that had started to tremble. The words on the screen felt like they were written in a foreign language, even though I understood each one perfectly. The will transferred 100% of my assets to Rachel Ann Anderson nee Carter. Not to Ethan. Not split between them. Everything to Rachel alone. My house, the one Helen and I had designed with our own hands, sketching floor plans at this very table. My savings, modest but carefully built over 4 decades of steady work. My life insurance policy, the one meant to ensure Ethan would never struggle the way I had as a young man. All of it signed over to a woman who'd made me serve drinks at her wedding. I scrolled down, my architect's eye catching the details that didn't align. The witness signatures at the bottom included 2 names, Ethan Marcus Anderson and someone called Jennifer Hollis, notary public. I'd never met a Jennifer Hollis. I'd never signed this document in front of any notary. But there, in what looked remarkably like my handwriting, was a signature that could have fooled even me if I didn't know with absolute certainty that I'd never put pen to this paper. Attached to the will was a second document, and this one made my chest tighten with something beyond anger. It was a letter on medical letterhead from Neurology Associates of Virginia. Patient William Anderson, D.O.B. The 15th of March 1962, it began. Patient exhibits signs of progressive cognitive decline, including memory loss, confusion regarding financial matters, and diminished capacity for independent decision-making. It is my professional recommendation that legal conservatorship be established to protect patients' interests and assets. Signed, Dr. Patricia Moss, neurologist. I read it 3 times. I'd never been to a neurologist. I'd never experienced memory loss beyond the normal frustrations of age. Dr. Patricia Moss, if she even existed, had certainly never examined me. The pieces assembled themselves in my mind, the way a blueprint reveals a building's structure. This wasn't just a forged document. This was infrastructure. This was a plan carefully constructed, waiting for the right moment to be executed. The fake medical assessment would explain why I'd supposedly signed away everything to my daughter-in-law instead of my son. The notary signature would give it legal weight. Ethan's name as witness would eliminate any challenge from him, making him complicit whether he knew it or not. And if I died tomorrow, this document would be submitted to probate court, whereas Miss Porter had taught me most paperwork gets processed with minimal scrutiny if it looks legitimate enough. I didn't waste time with shock or disbelief. I copied every file onto 2 additional drives, unplugged the original, and drove straight to Miss Porter's office without calling ahead. Her secretary tried to tell me she was in a meeting, but I walked past the desk and knocked on her door anyway. Margaret looked up from her conference table, where 3 other attorneys sat reviewing contracts. She took one look at my face and stood immediately. "Gentlemen, will resume this afternoon." They filed out, curious but professional. I handed her the USB drive. She plugged it into her computer and read in silence. I watched her expression shift from concern to something colder, harder. When she finished, she removed her reading glasses and set them on the desk with deliberate care. "Bill, this is a draft conspiracy to commit fraud. She hasn't filed it yet, which means she's waiting. But she's built the entire infrastructure. If you died tomorrow, she'd submit this to probate court. With your supposed cognitive decline documented by a medical professional, Ethan's signature as witness, and a notarized seal, most courts would accept it without deep investigation, especially if you're not alive to contest it." I found my voice, and it came out steadier than I expected. So, she wasn't planning to humiliate me. She was planning to bury me. Margaret's jaw tightened. Yes, and she almost succeeded. I thought I'd lost my pride. Turns out I almost lost my life. Margaret cleared her calendar for the next 2 days. We worked in her office from dawn until well past dinner, constructing what she called a legal fortress around everything I owned. The authentic will, the one I'd actually created and signed, with witnesses I could name, and a notary whose office I could walk into, was pulled from her files and re-executed with updated language. This time we added specific provisions. Everything would go to Ethan, but only after certain conditions were verified, including confirmation that he had no knowledge of any fraudulent documents created in my name. Margaret's pen moved across legal pads with swift precision as she drafted trust documents, her years of experience evident in every clause. The Helen Anderson Memorial Trust took shape over those 2 days, an irrevocable structure designed to hold my assets beyond anyone's reach except my own. Margaret explained each section as she wrote, her voice clinical but not unkind. The house would transfer into the trust. My savings accounts, my retirement funds, the life insurance policy, all of it sheltered under Helen's name where Rachel's forged documents couldn't touch them. We filed paperwork with the county clerk's office, establishing that any will submitted under my name would require my physical presence for verification, complete with government identification and a witness statement of authenticity. It was an unusual request, Margaret admitted, but not unprecedented for someone who'd discovered they were a target of elder fraud. On the second afternoon, as we reviewed the final documents spread across her conference table, Margaret leaned back in her chair and studied me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Bill, you understand what this means, don't you? If Rachel tries to file that fake will, now she'll be walking straight into felony fraud charges. But this also means you're declaring war. There's no reconciliation after this. No possibility of pretending it was all a misunderstanding. Are you ready for that?" I thought about the apron with my family name embroidered across it. I thought about 2.3 million people watching me serve champagne. I thought about the forged signature that looked so much like mine it could have been traced, about the fake medical diagnosis designed to strip me of my competence and autonomy. "I built homes for 40 years, Margaret," I said, meeting her eyes. "I know how to lay a foundation that won't crumble. And I know when a structure is built on sand." She nodded once, signed the final document as witness, and stood to shake my hand. "Then let's make sure yours stands." That evening I drove to Oakwood Cemetery as the sun began its descent. Helen's grave sat on a gentle slope, overlooking a pond where geese gathered in the evenings. Her headstone was simple granite, exactly as she'd wanted, with her name and the dates that bookended a life too short, and the inscription we'd chosen together, "She built with love." I knelt on the grass, still slightly damp from yesterday's rain, and traced the carved letters of her name with my fingertips. "They drew up my death on paper, Helen," I said, quietly aware that a groundskeeper trimming hedges 50 yards away might think me strange for talking to stone. Made me a ghost before I stopped breathing. Erased me like I was just a line item in someone else's budget. A breeze moved through the oak trees surrounding the cemetery, rustling leaves in a sound that almost felt like a response. "But you taught me something I'd forgotten. Architects don't destroy, do they? We expose faulty structures. We identify the cracks, the weight-bearing walls that were never meant to hold weight, and then we rebuild." I pulled a white rose from inside my jacket, one I'd cut from the bush. Helen had planted the year we finished building our house. I laid it against the base of her headstone. "I won't let them erase us. Not you, not me, not what we built together." The groundskeeper had stopped trimming and stood motionless, watching me from his distant vantage point. I wondered if he sensed that something monumental was beginning, if the air itself carried the weight of promises made and lines being drawn. When I returned home, the house felt different, charged with purpose rather than grief. I made coffee, opened my laptop at the kitchen table, and logged into my banking portal. The accounts loaded slowly, each one a reminder of the ways I'd tried to help Ethan build a life. Rachel's boutique loan, where I'd co-signed for $120,000, believing I was supporting my future daughter-in-law's dream. The mortgage on their house, $450,000 that my credit score and assets had guaranteed when their income alone wasn't enough. The car lease for $60,000, another place where my name served as collateral, as proof of stability. My name was the foundation holding their empire together, the load-bearing wall they'd built their entire structure upon. And foundations I knew from decades of experience could be removed. I opened my email and began typing to the bank's guarantor services department. Effective immediately, I revoke all personal guarantees associated with accounts ending in 4782991 and 3304. My cursor hovered over the send button. One click would change everything. One click would bring their carefully constructed world down around them. I thought about Ethan's text, the one that told me not to be sensitive. I thought about Rachel's thank you video monetizing my humiliation. I thought about the forged will with my name signed in someone else's hand. I clicked send. The email whooshed into the void with a sound like a long-held breath finally released. I planned to withdraw my money. Now I'd withdraw their mercy. For 3 days I heard nothing. The silence felt like the stillness before a controlled demolition, that brief moment when charges have been set but gravity hasn't yet taken hold. I went about my routine with careful normalcy, grocery shopping, tending the garden, organizing Helen's old recipe cards that I still couldn't bring myself to throw away. On the morning of the 4th day, my phone rang. Margaret's voice carried a note of grim satisfaction. The bank's automated system flagged all 3 accounts this morning. It's begun. I imagined Rachel at her laptop watching her carefully curated world start to pixelate and glitch. According to Margaret's contacts at the bank, Rachel's boutique credit line had frozen mid-transaction while she was processing a $30,000 inventory order for the spring season. The system had simply stopped, declined, rolled back as if the money had never existed. Suppliers who'd been waiting for payment started sending urgent emails, then formal demands, then threats to pursue collections. The mortgage company had generated an automatic letter requiring re-verification of income within 30 days standard procedure when a guarantor withdraws. Their car lease company had sent an even more direct message: provide alternate collateral within 15 days or return the vehicle to the nearest dealership. I pictured Rachel refreshing her banking app over and over, as if the numbers might change through sheer force of will, as if my name might magically reappear as the foundation warping up her accounts. Margaret told me later that Rachel had called the bank 4 times that afternoon, her voice escalating from confused to angry to something approaching panic. But banks don't reverse automated fraud protection triggers based on emotion. They require documentation verification signatures from all parties. And I wasn't signing anything. That evening, my phone buzzed with a text from Ethan. "Dad, Rachel says something's wrong with her accounts. Do you know anything about this?" I didn't respond. 10 minutes later, another message. "She thinks you did something." "Did you?" I set the phone on the kitchen counter and made myself dinner, a simple pasta dish Helen used to make when she was too tired for anything elaborate. The phone kept buzzing, lighting up with incoming messages I didn't read. The pregnancy announcement appeared on Instagram just after 7 that night. I wasn't following Rachel's account anymore, but Margaret had set up a monitoring service that sent us screenshots of anything relevant. The image showed a pregnancy test balanced on a white marble counter, 2 pink lines visible in the small window, the lighting professionally arranged to look casual. The caption read, "Our greatest adventure begins," followed by a heart emoji and a baby emoji, and the hashtag #BabyAnderson. Within minutes, the comments section flooded with congratulations and blessings and exclamation points. "After everything with your FIL, this is such a blessing," one comment read, as if my humiliation had been merely a prelude to this joyous announcement. My phone rang. Ethan's name appeared on the screen. I let it go to voicemail, then listened as his voice, thick with tears, filled my kitchen. "Dad, I don't know if you've seen, but Rachel's pregnant. We're having a baby. You're going to be a grandfather. I know things have been difficult, but this changes everything, doesn't it? Can we please talk, please?" There was desperation in his voice that might have moved me if I hadn't seen the forged will with his name signed as witness. If I hadn't known that my son had participated willingly or not in planning my erasure. A text followed the voicemail. "Dad, you're going to be a grandfather. Can we please talk?" I read it twice, felt nothing, and set the phone face down on the counter. The timing was too convenient, too perfectly calculated. A pregnancy announced the same day her financial world began collapsing, a human shield raised exactly when she needed maximum sympathy and minimum scrutiny. I'd built enough structures in my life to recognize load-bearing fabrications when I saw them. Margaret called as I was washing dishes. The county tax assessor's office flagged Rachel's boutique for unpaid sales tax. $18,000 overdue, dating back 9 months. They're moving to freeze her business license. I dried my hands on a kitchen towel and walked to the window where rain had begun streaking the glass. "Let it freeze," I said quietly, watching water pool in the garden Helen had planted. Structures built on lies can't survive winter. After we hung up, I went to the bedroom and opened Helen's jewelry box, the cherrywood one I'd made for our 25th anniversary. Beneath her wedding ring and the pearl earrings she wore every Sunday, I found the letter she'd written me during one of her final hospital stays. Her handwriting had been shaky but determined the way she'd approached everything in those last months. I unfolded the paper carefully, my eyes finding the line she'd underlined twice. Justice doesn't shout, Bill. It waits. I refolded the letter, placed it back beneath her rings, and returned to the kitchen where my phone still lay face down. Ethan's message waited unanswered. Rachel's pregnancy announcement was probably gathering thousands more congratulatory comments, by now building a narrative of new life and fresh beginnings that would make any financial investigation seem cruel and heartless. But I'd learned something in 40 years of architecture: you can't build the second floor until you've addressed the cracks in the foundation. And their foundation was nothing but cracks. New life couldn't hide old lies. But they'd learn that soon enough. Margaret's investigator kept me informed of developments I couldn't witness directly, details that painted a picture of an empire built on credit finally meeting the reality of consequences. The certified letter arrived at their house on a Tuesday morning, the kind that requires a signature and can't be ignored or deleted like an email. Notice of default, 30 days to cure, printed in bold letters across the top of mortgage company letterhead. Without my guarantee backing their loan, the bank wanted verification that Ethan and Rachel could actually afford the $450,000 mortgage on their own. Ethan made good money as an attorney, comfortable by most standards, but they'd stretched themselves impossibly thin when purchasing the house, counting on my name to bridge the gap between their income and their ambitions. The investigator told me Rachel stood at their kitchen counter opening mail with shaking hands, envelope after envelope, revealing the scope of their collapse. Boutique suppliers demanding immediate payment for orders she'd placed months ago, confident that credit would always be available. Credit card statements showing minimum payments that had once been manageable, but now represented choices between groceries and avoiding default. A letter from the county about the frozen business license, formal language, explaining that commerce couldn't continue until tax obligations were satisfied. She threw the papers across the kitchen, my investigator said, watching them scatter like leaves, her voice rising to a pitch that carried through the walls to where neighbors pretended not to hear. Your father is destroying us. The words echoed in the report I read that evening, sitting in my living room with a cup of tea growing cold. Ethan's response came quieter but no less cutting. Maybe we deserve it. That sentence sat with me long after I'd finished reading. Maybe. Such a small word to carry the weight of recognition of reality finally penetrating the bubble they'd constructed around their choices. The fights intensified over the following days, their voices loud enough that neighbors began closing windows when evening came. Margaret's investigator compiled recordings from a noise complaint filed by the couple next door, documentation we might need later, but that I found painful to review. Rachel's voice dominated most exchanges, accusatory and sharp. She blamed Ethan for doing nothing to fix the crisis, for failing to call his father enough, for not having the courage to repair what she'd broken. Ethan pushed back with questions that seemed to surprise even him. You humiliated him on camera. What did you expect? That he'd just keep paying for everything while you turned him into entertainment? One night, their argument crescendoed to the point where Rachel screamed something that the investigator's audio captured with painful clarity. I made us money. I made us relevant. What did he ever do except sit in his boring little house with his boring little life? The sound of a door slamming followed hard enough that the neighbor's report mentioned pictures rattling on shared walls. That night, according to phone records Margaret obtained through legal channels, Ethan tried calling me 6 times in 2 hours. Each call went to voicemail. Each voicemail went unheard. The debt collector's call came on a Thursday afternoon while Ethan was at work. Margaret had anticipated it, had actually warned me it was coming based on the cascade pattern she'd seen in dozens of similar financial collapses. Mr. Anderson, the recorded conversation began, professional but implacable. This is Allied Financial Recovery. We're calling regarding outstanding debts under your name accounts totaling $87,000. Ethan's voice on the recording went thin with confusion. I don't have any debts. There must be a mistake. The collector's response came with practiced patience. According to our records, you co-signed loans for Carter Boutique LLC and a personal line of credit in 2022. The accounts are now severely delinquent. Margaret played me that recording in her office 2 days later. We listened to Ethan's breathing change, the long pause before he said he'd have to call back. The investigator's report detailed what happened next. Ethan, confronting Rachel that evening with printouts from the debt collector, his hands shaking as he pointed to signatures that looked like his, but that he couldn't remember. Making. Rachel's dismissal came swift and casual. It's just business paperwork, Ethan. You're overreacting. I needed your signature for the LLC filing. It's completely normal. But Ethan wasn't convinced. The investigator noted him sitting alone in his car in their driveway for 40 minutes after that conversation, his phone's screen glowing as he searched terms like debt fraud, spouse and liable for partner's loans, and unauthorized use of signature. The first search result Margaret showed me read, "You may be liable for debts incurred in your name, even without your explicit knowledge, if you signed authorization documents." Ethan had called his father 7 more times that night. I'd let each one go unanswered. From my quiet house across town, I reviewed these reports with a strange mixture of satisfaction and sorrow. This was the son I'd raised, finally asking the right questions, finally seeing the structure he'd built his life upon for what it was. But the questions came too late, prompted not by conscience, but by consequences. Margaret closed the file folder and looked at me across her desk. Their drowning bill. In debt they didn't even know existed. I nodded slowly, thinking about ropes and rescue and the difference between the two. They were drowning in debt they didn't know existed, and I held the only rope. The knock came on a Saturday afternoon while I was in the workshop sanding down a piece of oak I'd been meaning to turn into a bookshelf for months. The pounding was urgent, almost violent, accompanied by a voice I'd once known as well as my own. "Dad, please, I need help." I set down the sandpaper and walked slowly to the front window, positioning myself where I could see the porch without being seen. Ethan stood there, his face red and tear-streaked, his dress shirt untucked and wrinkled like he'd been wearing it for days. His hands were shaking as he knocked again. Part of me wanted to let him stand there until he gave up and left. Part of me wanted to watch him experience just a fraction of the helplessness I'd felt standing in that wedding reception with an apron in my hands. But curiosity is a powerful thing, and I'd spent too many years as an architect not to want to see how structures fail from the inside. I opened the door. "Come in," I said, my voice neutral, offering neither warmth nor hostility. Ethan stumbled across the threshold like a man who'd been holding himself upright through sheer will and had finally found a place to collapse. He made it to the couch before his legs gave out, sinking into the cushions where he used to sit as a boy watching Saturday morning cartoons. "Dad, I don't know what Rachel did, but creditors are calling me. There are debts I didn't sign for. I swear I didn't know about any of this." She must have forged. I walked to the kitchen, filled the kettle, and set it on the stove. The familiar ritual of making tea gave me time to arrange my thoughts, to prepare for a conversation I'd been rehearsing in my mind for weeks. When I returned with 2 cups, I sat in the armchair across from him, the coffee table between us serving as both physical barrier and symbolic divide. "Didn't you?" I asked, my voice calm but surgical in its precision. Ethan looked up, confusion and panic mixing in his expression. "Didn't I know about what Rachel was doing?" I sipped my tea, let the silence stretch. "Did you ever sign documents for Rachel's business?" He nodded almost reflexively. "She said it was standard LLC paperwork. Operating agreements, that kind of thing. She needed my signature because we're married and it affected our joint assets." I set my cup down carefully. "Did you sign anything related to my estate?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Ethan's face changed, a shadow passing behind his eyes that told me everything before he opened his mouth. The pause stretched so long I could hear the kitchen clock ticking in the next room. He began, then stopped. Started again. "She showed me a will." "Your will?" "She said you wanted to update it. That you were worried about memory issues. About making sure everything was handled properly if something happened." My hands tightened around my teacup, but my voice remained steady. "And you signed as a witness." Ethan's face crumbled like wet paper. Tears started flowing freely now, his voice breaking into fragments. "She said you'd already approved it. That you'd met with a lawyer, but the paperwork needed witness signatures, and you'd asked her to handle it because you didn't want to make a big deal about it. She said you were embarrassed about the memory thing, that you didn't want me to worry. I thought I was helping. Dad, I thought I raised my hand." "Stop." The room went silent, except for the ticking clock and Ethan's ragged breathing. I stood slowly, walked to the drawer where I kept my phone and pulled it out. My finger hovered over the screen for a moment before I pressed play. Ethan's voice filled the room, tinny, but clear. She said, "You'd already approved it. That you'd met with a lawyer, but the paperwork needed witness signatures. I thought I was helping." I stopped the recording and looked at my son. "I've been recording since you arrived, Ethan. You just admitted you signed a fraudulent will as a witness." The color drained from his face so completely he looked like he might faint. "Dad, I didn't know it was fake." "I swear to God I didn't know. You knew I never had memory issues," I said, my voice quiet but sharp enough to cut through his protests. "You knew I never mentioned updating my will. You knew I would have told you directly if I wanted to change something that important. But you signed anyway because it was easier than questioning your wife. Because believing her story meant you didn't have to confront what kind of person she really is." Ethan tried to speak, his mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. I watched him struggle, this man, who'd once been the boy I taught to ride a bicycle and tie his shoes and stand up for what was right. My eyes filled with tears I refused to let fall, but my voice remained steady. "My son knew they were burying me alive," I said, and he handed them the shovel. The silence that followed felt like the moment after a building falls when the dust hasn't settled and you can't yet see what remains standing. I wanted to forgive him. Now I had to choose my blood or justice. After Ethan left my house that afternoon, stumbling to his car like a man who'd just watched his own life collapse in real time, I sat with the recording for an hour before driving to Margaret's office. She was working through files when I arrived, her reading glasses perched on her nose, the late afternoon sun cutting sharp angles through her window blinds. I handed her my phone without preamble. She listened to the recording, once her expression neutral and professional. Then she played it again, this time taking notes in the precise shorthand I'd seen her use during depositions. When the recording ended the second time, she set down her pen and looked at me with an expression that mixed legal assessment with something closer to sympathy. "This is admissible evidence of complicity, Bill. Ethan signed a fraudulent document as a witness, even if he claims he didn't understand what he was signing. In Virginia, that's a Class 6 felony. Up to 5 years in prison, though first offense with claimed ignorance might get him probation." She paused, removing her glasses and setting them on the desk with deliberate care. "But Bill, he's your son. If you file charges, the Virginia State Bar will suspend his license immediately pending investigation. Even if he avoids prison, he loses his law license permanently. His career ends. Everything he's built professionally disappears." I stood and walked to her office window, looking down at the street below, where people moved through their Saturday errands with no idea that lives were being weighed and measured in the offices above them. "What would you do?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her tone carried the weight of decades practicing law, of seeing families torn apart by precisely these kinds of decisions. I'd ask myself, is he remorseful because he's caught or because he's guilty? Does he regret the action or just the consequence? The question sat between us unanswered as I returned to my chair. Margaret filed the recording in her safe and moved to the next item on her investigator's report. "We need to talk about Rachel's pregnancy," she said, pulling out a manila folder thick with documents. Her investigator had been thorough, perhaps more thorough than I'd authorized, but I wasn't complaining. There were no OB/GYN appointments on their insurance records, which the investigator had accessed through channels Margaret assured me were legal, if ethically gray. No prenatal vitamin prescriptions filled at any pharmacy. No ultrasound images posted to social media, which Margaret noted was remarkable for an influencer who documented every meal and outfit choice for her followers. The investigator had gone further, pulling hospital records from a Freedom of Information request that took advantage of Rachel's own social media posts about an ER visit 3 months prior. She'd complained online about a sprained ankle from a hiking accident, posted photos of herself in a hospital bed with an ice pack, and a dramatic caption about learning to slow down. The intake form from that visit sat in front of me now, Rachel's handwriting clear and unmistakable in response to the standard question, "Are you pregnant?" Her answer checked in her own hand, "No." Margaret slid the document across her desk. "She's not pregnant, Bill. She's using the idea of a baby as a human shield, banking on the fact that no one wants to be the villain who goes after a pregnant woman, that you'll back off rather than seem cruel." I studied the form, this small piece of paper that demolished an entire narrative, and made a decision that would define the next 2 months of my life. I would disappear, completely. No responses to Ethan's increasingly desperate texts. No public statements. No angry letters from lawyers. Just silence, absolute and total, the kind that makes people wonder if you've given up or if you're planning something they can't yet see. Margaret's investigator reported back weekly. Rachel had interpreted my silence as surrender, telling Ethan with apparent relief, that I'd finally accepted defeat, that they'd survive this storm and emerge stronger. Ethan wasn't convinced, the investigator noted, but he wanted to believe her because the alternative was confronting truths he wasn't ready to face. Meanwhile, I met with Margaret every week in her office, refining details with the precision I'd once applied to architectural blueprints. We rented a private medical suite in a building across town, the kind of discreet space used for minor procedures and consultations. I hired actors through a theatrical agency, paying them well for absolute discretion. I scripted every moment, every word, every gesture, revising and rehearsing until the sequence played perfectly in my mind. During one of these planning sessions, Margaret set down her pen and studied me across her desk. "Bill, are you absolutely sure about this? Once we execute this plan, there's no taking it back. The consequences will be permanent." I met her eyes with a certainty I'd felt only a handful of times in my life, the same certainty I'd had when I'd asked Helen to marry me, when I'd started my own architecture firm, when I'd held my newborn son for the first time. "I'm an architect, Margaret. I don't improvise. I design. And I've been designing this for 2 months. She nodded slowly, understanding that we'd crossed a threshold from which there was no return. Silence isn't weakness. It's the blueprint, being drawn in the dark. The night we chose was a Friday, deliberately selected because people are tired at the end of the week, their judgment dulled by exhaustion and the promise of weekend rest. At 11:47 p.m., Margaret sent the text from her phone to both Ethan and Rachel. "Your father collapsed at home. Paramedics transported him to street. Mary's ICU. Doctors say it's critical heart failure. He's asking for you. Room 304. Then we waited in the rented medical suite, me lying on the hospital bed, while the makeup artist applied the final touches of theatrical pallor to my skin, showing me in a hand mirror how convincingly dead I looked. Margaret's investigator, positioned in a car outside Ethan and Rachel's house, reported their reactions via text. Rachel had been scrolling through her phone when the message arrived. Her first words, captured by the investigator's parabolic microphone aimed at their bedroom window, weren't concern or grief. They were calculation. "Is the will updated?" Ethan's response came sharp and horrified. "He's dying, Rachel." But the investigator noted a pause, a moment of silence, where even Ethan seemed to be running numbers in his head, wondering what his father's death might mean for the debts crushing them. They'd driven to the hospital in separate cars, the investigator following at a discreet distance, reporting that neither spoke during the journey. I lay in the dimmed room, oxygen mask fitted over my face, connected to monitors that beeped with fabricated vital signs. The actress playing the nurse had worked in actual hospitals for 15 years before transitioning to theatrical work, and her performance was flawless. When Ethan and Rachel arrived at room 304, she greeted them with exactly the right mixture of professional sympathy and clinical detachment. "He's been unresponsive for about an hour," she said, her voice low and serious. "The doctor says he may have another cardiac event at any moment. I'm sorry, but you probably have 30 minutes at most." She touched Ethan's arm with practiced compassion, nodded solemnly at Rachel, and left the room, closing the door behind her with a soft click. Through the slits of my barely closed eyes, I watched Ethan approach the bed. His face was wrecked with tears, his hand reaching out to touch mine where it lay motionless on the white sheet. "Dad," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry. For everything. For not believing you, for not protecting you, for being too weak to stand up when it mattered." Real grief, I thought. Or at least grief mixed with guilt, which is its own kind of authenticity. Rachel hung back near the door, arms crossed, her eyes scanning the room rather than looking at me. She checked her phone, the screen's glow, illuminating her face in the dim light. Then, apparently deciding I was unconscious enough not to hear, she moved closer to Ethan and lowered her voice to what she must have thought was a whisper. "Where's the will stored?" "The real one, not the one she caught herself, but the damage was done." Ethan turned to stare at her, his expression shifting from grief to something approaching horror. "Not now, Rachel." But Rachel was already committed to her path, emboldened by what she thought was the privacy of a dying man's hospital room. She moved even closer to the bed, studying my face with clinical detachment. "How much do you think this place costs per night? Are we responsible for his bills? Because with everything that's happening with the boutique and the mortgage..." "Stop." Ethan hissed, but Rachel continued as if she hadn't heard. "Him. I'm just saying if he doesn't make it, we need to know what's in the will." The real version. Because if he changed it after everything that happened, we're completely the monitors flatlined. The steady beep transformed into one long, continuous tone that filled the room like a siren. Rachel jumped backward, her hand flying to her mouth. Ethan's knees seemed to buckle as he grabbed the bed rail. No, 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 Dad, please. I opened my eyes, sat up smoothly, pulled the oxygen mask from my face and let it dangle from its tubing. I'm not dead, I said, my voice clear and strong. But your hearts are. Rachel's face went from shock to confusion to dawning horror in the span of 3 seconds. Ethan froze completely, a statue of a man caught between grief and incomprehension. I pointed to the corners of the room where tiny red lights blinked on cameras I'd had installed that afternoon. Then I gestured to the monitor mounted on the wall, which flickered to life, showing not vital signs but a live stream interface. The viewer count climbed in real time: 14293, 14301, 14315. Margaret stepped out from behind the curtain where she'd been standing for the past 40 minutes, tablet in her hand, her face set in professional granite. Every word recorded, she said. Every frame live-streamed. The footage is already backed up to 3 separate servers and has been simultaneously filed with the Virginia State Bar Ethics Committee. Rachel found her voice first, though it came out strangled and thin. This is illegal. You can't. This is entrapment. This is theater, I said, swinging my legs over the side of the bed, my movements controlled and deliberate. No false police reports, no fraudulent death certificates. Just a private medical consultation suite rented legally with actors hired through legitimate channels. You were invited to visit someone you believed to be dying. Everything you said freely, and 30,000 people heard every word. The viewer count had passed 50,000. My phone, sitting on the side table, buzzed continuously with notifications. 5 million people watched them bury me alive and watched me bury them in truth. The live stream didn't stop when Rachel and Ethan fled the hospital room. Margaret had set it to continue for another hour, capturing the comment section as it exploded in real time. Thousands of voices pouring in from across the country and then the world. By the time the sun rose Saturday morning, the video had been viewed 5.2 million times. I watched the numbers climb from my actual home, no longer pretending to be anywhere else, drinking coffee at my kitchen table while the internet did what the internet does best. It took something viral and made it inescapable. Clips circulated across every platform Margaret and I monitored. TikTok users created reaction videos, their faces shifting from confusion to shock to righteous anger as they watched Rachel ask about my will while thinking I was dying. Twitter erupted with hashtags that trended for 3 consecutive days: #FakeFamily, #ICUTrap, #ElderJustice. News outlets picked up the story by Sunday morning, framing it with headlines that ranged from sympathetic to sensational. Viral father fakes death to expose daughter-in-law's greed ran on CNN. The ICU trap, when elder abuse meets social media, appeared in the Washington Post. Local Virginia stations sent reporters to stand outside my house, though I declined all interview requests through Margaret, letting the video speak for itself. The comment sections became a digital tribunal. Thousands of people who'd never met me wrote paragraphs defending my actions, sharing their own stories of family betrayal and financial exploitation. Others tagged Rachel's Instagram account, her boutique page, every brand partnership she'd ever posted. Her follower count dropped precipitously, losing 60,000 people overnight, as if a dam had broken and her audience was flooding away. The brands moved even faster. By Monday morning, every company that had paid her for the wedding humiliation content sent identical termination emails. Margaret's investigator collected them all, and I read through them with grim satisfaction. One from the luxury wine company read, "Your actions contradict our family values and brand mission. We're ending our partnership effective immediately and requesting return of all promotional compensation." Rachel's phone, according to Ethan's later testimony, buzzed so continuously with notifications that she finally threw it across their bedroom. It cracked against the wall, the screen spiderwebbing but still glowing with incoming messages she couldn't stop. The pregnancy lie collapsed under its own weight within 48 hours. A viewer with apparent medical knowledge commented on one of Rachel's old Instagram posts, "You announced your pregnancy 2 months ago. Where's the baby bump? Most women show by 16 weeks. Another woman, claiming to be 12 weeks pregnant herself, posted side-by-side photos, comparing her visible pregnancy to Rachel's flat stomach in recent photos. The comments multiplied like cells dividing speculation building until someone found the smoking gun. Margaret's investigator had anonymously leaked Rachel's intake form from 3 months prior, the one where she'd checked no when asked if she was pregnant. The document appeared first on a medical ethics forum, then migrated to Reddit, where a thread titled "Rachel Anderson Fake Pregnancy Evidence" accumulated 90,000 upvotes in 6 hours. Users cross-referenced dates, analyzed photos, built timelines that demonstrated the mathematical impossibility of her claims. Rachel's response came in the form of a tearful video posted to Instagram, her face blotchy and swollen as she claimed she'd suffered a miscarriage and begged for privacy. But she'd disabled comments, which only made people more certain she was lying. That night, according to the investigator's report, Ethan confronted her in their bedroom with his phone showing the document. "Were you ever pregnant?" His voice was flat, exhausted. Rachel's silence stretched long enough to be its own confession. Ethan walked out of the bedroom and spent the night on their couch, staring at the ceiling. 1 week after the ICU trap, my doorbell rang on a Tuesday afternoon. I checked the security camera I'd installed and saw Rachel and Ethan standing on my porch. Rachel wore no makeup, plain jeans, and a simple sweater, the carefully constructed costume of someone seeking forgiveness. Ethan's eyes were bloodshot, his posture defeated. I opened the door and stepped aside without speaking, letting them enter the home they'd tried to steal through forgery. Rachel began before she'd even fully crossed the threshold. "Dad, we came to apologize. What happened at the hospital, what I said it wasn't. I was in shock. I wasn't thinking clearly." I raised my hand, stopping her mid-sentence. My eyes had already found what I was looking for. The small, rectangular bulge in Ethan's jacket pocket, positioned exactly where a recording device would sit. I smiled faintly, the expression of someone who'd anticipated every move in a game the other players didn't know they were losing. "Before you continue," I said, my voice calm and measured, "I should tell you that I'm recording this conversation. For legal purposes, you understand." Ethan's face drained of color so completely he looked like he might faint. His hand moved to his jacket pocket with the jerky motion of someone whose body was betraying their intentions. He pulled out a small digital voice recorder, held it in his palm for a moment as if hoping it might disappear, then set it on my coffee table with a soft click. "We were." He started, his voice barely audible. "We were going to record too." I nodded slowly, walked to my bookshelf, and pointed to a lens no bigger than a shirt button mounted above the third shelf. "I know. My cameras caught you turning it on in the driveway, 2 minutes and 40 seconds ago, to be precise. You came here to provoke me into saying something you could use against me. Elder abuse, perhaps psychological manipulation, something that would make me look like the villain in this story." Rachel stood abruptly, her chair scraping against my hardwood floor. "This is insane. You're insane, recording us, trapping us, treating us like criminals." "What's insane?" I said, my voice dropping to something harder than steel, as thinking I'd fall for it twice. "They came to trap me. Instead, they filmed their final act." The recording of their failed ambush appeared online 36 hours later, uploaded by an elder advocacy journalist named Patricia Chen, who'd been following my story since the ICU trap went viral. Margaret claimed it was an accidental leak, that the file had been shared with Patricia for background research and somehow ended up published. But I knew Margaret well enough to recognize intentional precision disguised as mistake. The video spread faster than the original ICU footage, perhaps because this time there was no dramatic reveal, just the slow, inevitable exposure of two people who'd learned nothing from their first public humiliation. The headlines wrote themselves. "Daughter-in-law caught trying to frame elderly." "Father-in-law ran across news sites that had covered the wedding humiliation months ago." The narrative arc now complete. The Anderson family saga from apron to ankle monitor appeared in a viral Twitter thread that documented every stage of Rachel's fall. The comment sections became echo chambers of outrage, thousands of voices asking variations of the same question. She humiliated him, faked a pregnancy, forged his will, and still tried to manipulate him. Rachel's Instagram follower count, which had stabilized around 40,000 after the initial collapse, evaporated completely. Her account was mass reported for fraud and temporarily suspended pending review, her final posts frozen in digital amber for anyone curious enough to scroll through the wreckage of her influencer career. Ethan's law firm felt the pressure within hours. Margaret's contacts told her that the managing partner's email inbox filled with over 400 messages demanding Ethan's immediate termination, many from the firm's own clients threatening to take their business. Elsewhere, by Thursday afternoon, Ethan was called into a conference room where 3 senior partners sat in grim silence. The suspension was framed as temporary pending resolution of the ethics investigation, but everyone in that room knew that in legal circles being publicly associated with fraud was a career death sentence. Until this is resolved, you're a liability we can't afford, the managing partner had said, according to Ethan's own later account. His office was packed into boxes by security that same afternoon. The women's advocacy group statement arrived in my email Friday morning, forwarded by Margaret with a subject line that read simply, "Justice." The National Coalition for Reproductive Rights had published an open letter condemning Rachel for weaponizing pregnancy as a tool of manipulation and undermining the experiences of real survivors of miscarriage and pregnancy loss. The letter was signed by 43 organizations and had been picked up by major news outlets within hours of publication. Former brand sponsors who'd paid Rachel for family content now demanded refunds for promotional posts made under what they called fraudulent pretenses. One boutique supplier she'd partnered with filed a breach of contract lawsuit seeking $70,000 in damages. Rachel's business Instagram page, which she'd poured years of carefully curated content into, became a graveyard of one-star reviews. Liar, scammer, fraud. The words repeated in variations across hundreds of comments. The boutique closed officially on a Monday morning, a simple paper sign taped to the inside of the locked door, permanently closed. Margaret's investigator reported that Rachel spent those weeks in bed with the curtains drawn, her room dark at all hours. Ethan brought her food that went uneaten, tried to initiate conversations that died in monosyllables. For the first time in years, she had no audience to perform, for no metrics to track, no validation to numb whatever she felt beneath the carefully constructed persona. The silence, the investigator noted, seemed to terrify her more than any of the public consequences. I didn't gloat. Gloating would have diminished what this had become, would have made it about personal vengeance rather than something larger. When Patricia Chen asked if I'd appear on her news segment about elder abuse, I agreed on the condition that Rachel's name would be mentioned only once in context, and that the focus would remain on the systemic issue rather than individual villainy. The segment titled "Standing Up to Elder Abuse" aired on a Wednesday evening. I sat in Patricia's studio and spoke with a calm I'd practiced in front of Margaret's office mirror. "I'm not special," I said, looking directly into the camera. "What happened to me happens to thousands of families across this country every single day. Adult children who see their parents as ATMs instead of human beings. Families that confuse inheritance with entitlement. I had resources to fight back a lawyer who believed me, savings to pay for investigators and legal fees. Most elderly victims of financial abuse don't have any of that. They suffer in silence because they're ashamed, or because they still love the people exploiting them, or because they don't know where to turn." The segment reached 2 million views in its first week. Donations flooded into the Elder Justice Foundation, a national nonprofit I'd barely heard of before Patricia mentioned them. $150,000 arrived in 7 days, much of it in small amounts, from people who wrote notes about their own parents, their own stories of exploitation, narrowly avoided or painfully endured. The foundation's director called me personally to say they'd never seen this kind of response to a single story. The viral video platforms paid me $43,000 in ad revenue from the combined footage. I signed the entire check over to the Elder Justice Foundation without hesitation. A journalist from the Washington Post wrote a profile titled, "The Architect of Justice: How William Anderson Turned Personal Humiliation into a National Movement." Margaret had the article framed before I even finished reading it. I hung it on the wall next to Helen's photo, where her smile seemed to approve of what her quiet husband had finally learned to build. They built their fame on cruelty. I turned their cruelty into a cause. 6 months passed in a silence so complete it felt like the story had finally ended. Rachel and Ethan vanished from my life as thoroughly as if they'd moved to another country, though Margaret's investigator confirmed they were still living in Virginia, renting a small apartment across town after losing the house to foreclosure. Divorce rumors circulated through mutual acquaintances, but nothing was ever confirmed, and I didn't ask for details. I'd settled into a routine that felt sustainable if not entirely fulfilling, volunteering twice a week at the community center, teaching basic carpentry to teenagers tending Helen's roses as they prepared for winter dormancy, meeting Margaret for coffee every Thursday to discuss anything, except legal matters. I thought the war was over, that we'd all retreated to our separate corners to heal or fester as our natures dictated. Then on a Saturday afternoon in early autumn, when the light slanted gold through the trees and the air carried the first whisper of wood smoke, my doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, and for a moment I considered ignoring it, but curiosity pulled me from the workshop where I'd been sanding a piece of walnut. I opened the door and found Rachel standing on my porch, but this Rachel looked nothing like the polished influencer who'd handed me an apron or the desperate woman who'd tried to record me for evidence. This Rachel wore jeans and a plain sweater, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, her face bare of makeup. And beside her, holding her hand with the unself-conscious trust that only small children possess, stood a boy of maybe 4 years old, with dark curly hair and eyes that seemed to take in everything with quiet curiosity. My breath caught before Rachel even spoke. "Dad," she said, her voice soft and tentative in a way I'd never heard it, "this is Mason, your grandson." The boy looked up at me with those wide, intelligent eyes and said in a voice clear as a bell, "Hi, Grandpa." I don't remember consciously deciding to invite them in, but suddenly we were in my living room and Mason was standing in front of the bookshelf where I kept the model ships I'd built over decades. "What are those?" he asked, pointing to a 3-masted schooner I'd spent 6 months perfecting when Ethan was in high school. I knelt beside him, my knees protesting the movement, but my heart ignoring everything except this child's presence. "These are ships I built. Model ships. See, you take all these tiny pieces and put them together, following plans, and eventually you have something beautiful." I pulled down the schooner carefully, held it where Mason could see the rigging detail, the miniature anchors, the hand-painted hull. His eyes lit up with wonder that seemed incapable of deception. "Did you build them by yourself? Some of them I built with my son, your father, when he was about your age." We'd sit at the kitchen table on Saturday mornings and work on them together. My voice cracked slightly on the memory, on the weight of time and loss, and the small boy in front of me, who represented a future I'd thought was gone forever. "Can you teach me?" Mason asked, and the hope in his voice was so pure it felt like a physical thing pressing against my chest. "I'd love to," I managed to say, and meant it with an intensity that frightened me. Rachel watched from the couch, a tissue clutched in her hand, her eyes red-rimmed in a way that looked authentic. "I kept him away because I didn't want him to see all the fighting," she said when Mason wandered to the window to watch a bird at the feeder. "I thought it would be better if he didn't know about any of this until things calmed down. But he deserves to know his grandfather. He deserves family." She paused, wiped her eyes. "I was wrong about everything, Dad. About how I treated you, about the priorities I had, about what really matters. I'm so sorry." I wanted to believe her. God help me, I wanted to believe her so badly it felt like a physical hunger I hadn't known I was carrying. This boy, this perfect small person who called me Grandpa and wanted to learn to build ships, represented redemption for all of us. A way forward that didn't require anyone to be the villain anymore. Mason stayed for 2 hours, during which time he asked about every object in my living room, drew a picture of the two of us standing next to a boat, and fell asleep on my couch, with his head on a cushion that still smelled faintly of Halen's lavender sachets. When Rachel woke him gently to leave, he hugged me with the fierce, uncomplicated affection of a child who hasn't learned to measure or withhold love. "Can I come back?" he asked. Anytime I said, and watched them walk to Rachel's car, Mason turning to wave from the driveway. That evening I called Margaret, my voice shaking with emotion I couldn't fully name. She brought my grandson. "He's perfect, Margaret. Sweet and curious and everything I imagined. Maybe I was too harsh. Maybe she's genuinely changing. Maybe people really can learn from their mistakes." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, and I could hear papers shuffling on her end. "Bill, did you know Ethan had a son?" The question hung in the air like smoke. "He never mentioned it," I said slowly, "but maybe they were keeping it private because of everything that happened. To protect him from the publicity." "Let me look into something," Margaret said, her tone careful in a way that made my stomach tighten. "Don't make any decisions yet. Don't sign anything, don't promise anything. Just wait." After we hung up, I walked to the refrigerator where Mason's drawing was taped at child height, the stick figure labeled Grandpa, holding what might have been a boat or might have been anything seen through a dry 4-year-old's inexperienced but enthusiastic hand. I traced the crayon lines with my fingertip and felt something dangerous bloom in my chest. Hope. She finally found my weakness, and he called me Grandpa. Over the next 2 weeks, Mason visited 3 more times, and with each visit I felt myself softening in ways I'd thought Rachel had permanently calcified. We built a simple wooden boat together at my workbench, Mason's small hands gripping the sandpaper with fierce concentration as I guided him through smoothing the hull. We drew pictures and read books from the shelf I'd kept for the grandchildren I'd always imagined. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, small inconsistencies began accumulating like sawdust in the corners of my workshop. One afternoon while we were drawing together, I asked casually, "What school do you go to, buddy?" Mason didn't look up from his crayon work, his answer coming with the unguarded honesty only children possess. Mountain View Elementary. The name meant nothing to me at first, just another elementary school somewhere in Virginia. But that night I searched for it online and felt my heart sink into my stomach. Mountain View Elementary was in Colorado Springs, 1,200 miles away from where we sat. The next visit brought another crack in the facade. Mason was telling me about his week when he mentioned missing someone's dog, his face lighting up with the particular joy children reserve for animals. "I miss Grandma Karen's dog. She has a big yellow lab named Buddy." Karen, Rachel's mother. I kept my voice gentle, curious rather than interrogative. "Do you live with Grandma?" Karen. Mason nodded enthusiastically, his curls bouncing. "Uh-huh. Mommy Rachel visits sometimes on weekends?" The words hit me like cold water. Mommy Rachel. Not just Rachel, not mom, but Mommy Rachel, the phrasing a child uses to distinguish between adults when clarification is needed. Mason seemed to realize his mistake immediately, his eyes going wide. "I mean, Mom. Just Mom." But the slip had been caught, and we both knew it. I took a photo of Mason playing with the wooden boat later that afternoon, sent it to Margaret with a single word: urgent. Margaret moved with a speed that told me she'd been anticipating this, that her lawyer's instincts had been whispering warnings even while I'd been taping crayon drawings to my refrigerator. She came to my house the day after Mason's last visit, arriving while Rachel was still there to pick him up. After they left, Margaret pulled a plastic bag from her purse containing the cup Mason had drunk from, sealed and labeled with the kind of chain of custody care that comes from years of handling evidence. "I need your permission to do this," she said, and I gave it with a nod too numb to speak. The DNA analysis took 72 hours. Margaret had obtained a hair sample from an old brush of Ethan's that I'd kept in a box of his childhood things, one of those items you save without quite knowing why, until the reason presents itself years later. The results came back on a Tuesday morning, 0% probability of paternal relationship between Ethan Marcus Anderson and the child identified as Mason Carter. Margaret didn't stop there. She cross-referenced social media, pulling up Facebook profiles I'd never thought to search. Rachel's younger brother, David Carter, lived in Denver with a son named Mason, age 4, whose face matched perfectly with the boy who'd called me Grandpa. The photos were dated, geotagged, undeniable. Margaret drove to my house that afternoon and spread the documents across my dining table like an architect, laying out blueprints for a building that should never have been constructed. "Bill," she said, her voice carrying both gentleness and steel, "this is Rachel's nephew. She brought him here, coached him, used him as a prop in her final attempt to manipulate you." I stared at the photos of Mason with his actual father David at a Denver zoo, at a playground, at birthday parties I'd never been invited to because I wasn't actually his grandfather. My hands shook as I picked up the DNA report and read the cold scientific language that destroyed the warmth I'd felt watching him sand wood in my workshop. "She used a child," I said, my voice hollow. "She used innocence to sell you a lie," Margaret confirmed. I invited Rachel over the following day, telling her I wanted to discuss Mason's future, to plan regular visits, maybe even help with his education fund. She arrived with a smile I'd never seen on her face before, something that looked almost like genuine hope. She sat across from me at the kitchen table where Helen and I had shared 30 years of morning coffee, where I'd taught Ethan to do his homework, where I'd signed my authentic will and reviewed architectural plans and lived an honest life. I slid the DNA report across the table without preamble. Watched the color drain from Rachel's face as she read the header, her eyes scanning the results page with growing horror. "This is Mason's DNA," I said, my voice measured and cold. "It doesn't match Ethan's. It matches your brother David's. Mason is your nephew, not my grandson. You coached a 4-year-old child to lie to me, to call me grandpa, to build boats with me while you sat on my couch playing the role of a reformed woman." Rachel's mouth opened and closed, her hands trembling as she set down the paper. "I can explain. It's not what you think. I just wanted to give you what you wanted. A grandchild. A reason to forgive. I thought if you could just see." "No," I interrupted, my voice quiet but absolute. "You can't explain this. You've forged documents in my name. You faked a pregnancy to manipulate my son. And now you've weaponized a child, an innocent 4-year-old boy who doesn't understand he's being used to con an old man desperate for family. I've dealt with humiliation. I've dealt with greed and fraud and betrayal. But this," my voice broke, despite my efforts to keep it steady. "This is evil, Rachel. This is using innocence itself as a tool of deception." I handed her a manila folder Margaret had prepared. Inside is a cease and desist order filed with the county court. "You are never to contact me again, directly or indirectly. If you do, I will file criminal charges for fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. The evidence is already compiled. Now get out of my house." Rachel stood on shaking legs, the folder clutched in her hands. For the first time since I'd met her, tears ran down her face that looked real, born not from performance but from the terrible recognition of consequences that couldn't be undone. She left in tears. For once they weren't fake, they were fear. A week passed in heavy silence after Rachel left with the cease and desist order. I spent most of that time in my workshop sanding pieces of wood. I had no plans for the repetitive motion, a meditation that kept my hands busy while my mind processed the latest betrayal. The doorbell rang on a gray Thursday afternoon when rain threatened but hadn't yet begun to fall. I considered ignoring it, exhausted by confrontations and revelations, but something made me walk to the door and check the security camera. An elderly woman stood on my porch, maybe 70 years old, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. Her posture spoke of weariness that went deeper than physical fatigue, and her eyes, even through the grainy camera feed, looked red and swollen. I opened the door. She looked up at me with an expression that mixed shame, exhaustion, and genuine sorrow in proportions I recognized from my own mirror during the darkest days after Helen's death. "Mr. Anderson." Her voice was soft, defeated. "My name is Karen. I'm Rachel's mother." My first instinct was to close the door to protect myself from whatever new manipulation this might represent. But something in her face stopped me, something that looked incapable of deception because it was too worn down by truth. I stepped aside and let her enter. She moved to the couch and sat on its very edge as if afraid to claim more space than absolutely necessary, her hands trembling in her lap as she struggled to find words. "I saw everything online," she finally said, her voice breaking on the words. "The wedding video, the hospital live stream, the little boy who isn't really your grandson. All of it. I'm so sorry." Tears began streaming down her face, and unlike her daughter's practiced performances, these came with the ugly, uncontrolled rawness of real grief. "I know sorry isn't enough. I know it doesn't fix anything or undo the damage. But I needed you to hear it from me. I needed you to know that not everyone in her family thinks what she did was acceptable." I sat in the chair across from her, waiting. She wiped her eyes with a tissue pulled from her purse, took a shaking breath, and continued with words that seemed to have been rehearsed but came out broken anyway. "Rachel wasn't always like this. I need you to understand that, not to excuse her, but just so you know. She grew up poor, Mr. Anderson. We all did. Her father left when she was 6 years old, just walked out one day and never came back. I worked 3 jobs trying to keep the lights on, trying to make sure she had what she needed. It was never enough, but I tried." Karen's hands twisted the tissue into shreds as she spoke. "When Rachel married her first husband, a developer who had money and connections, she changed almost overnight. Suddenly, she had everything she'd never had growing up. The clothes, the house, the security. And when that marriage ended badly, when he left her for someone younger, she couldn't go back to being poor. It was like poverty was this trap she'd escaped from, and she'd rather do anything, lie, cheat, manipulate, destroy relationships, anything to keep from falling back into it. I listened without interrupting, watching this woman carry a burden that wasn't truly hers to bear. I tried to stop her, Karen continued, her voice strengthening slightly with the relief of confession. Months ago, after the wedding video went viral, I begged her to apologize to you properly, to take responsibility. She cut me off completely, told me I was holding her back, that I didn't understand how the world worked. I haven't spoken to her since the hospital incident. Karen reached into her purse and pulled out a white envelope, setting it on the coffee table between us, with the solemnity of someone presenting evidence at trial. This is everything I have. $30,000 in cashier's checks. My entire savings from 40 years of work. I want to pay you back for what she stole from you. I know it's not nearly enough to cover everything, but it's all I can offer. I looked at the envelope without touching it, then gently pushed it back across the table toward her. Karen, I don't want your money. You didn't do any of this. She did. You're not responsible for your daughter's choices. Karen broke down completely, then her shoulders shaking with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep and long suppressed. But I raised her. I must have failed somewhere, must have taught her the wrong lessons, or missed some crucial moment when I could have guided her differently. I interrupted her self-recrimination with words I'd learned from my own years of second-guessing every parenting decision. No. You loved her. That's not failure. What she became, the choices she made as an adult, those were hers alone to own. Love isn't a guarantee against someone choosing the wrong path. I paused, an idea forming, with the same clarity that used to strike me when designing buildings, when I could suddenly see how all the pieces might fit together into something functional and beautiful. But if you really want to help, if you want to do something meaningful with that money, use it to open a center. A place where women can get counseling, where people who've lost themselves to greed or desperation or the fear of poverty can learn there's another way forward. Teach them what Rachel never learned, that integrity matters more than appearance, that character outlasts wealth. Karen looked up at me, hope flickering in her exhausted eyes like a candle sheltered from wind. You think something like that could actually help people? I know it could, I said. And I'll fund the rest of what's needed. We'll call it the Helen Anderson Center for Second Chances. My wife always believed people deserved the opportunity to become better than they were. Karen's hands stopped trembling as she held my gaze. You'd really do that after everything? You came here seeking forgiveness for your daughter, I said. Instead, let's build something that gives both of you a purpose. She came seeking forgiveness for her daughter and found a purpose for them both. 6 months of planning transformed an abandoned community building on Maple Street into something that would have made Helen proud. The Helen Anderson Center for Second Chances opened on a Saturday morning in early spring, when the dogwoods were blooming and the air carried promise instead of threat. Karen had worked tirelessly alongside contractors and volunteers, her energy seemingly multiplied by purpose. The building now held 3 counseling rooms, a classroom for financial literacy workshops, a children's play area so parents could attend sessions without worry, and a community space large enough for the support groups that would become the center's beating heart. 50 people attended the opening ceremony, a number that seemed both modest and miraculous. They were mothers who'd lost themselves in addiction or abusive relationships, fathers struggling with unemployment and shame, adult children trying to navigate caring for aging parents, entire families seeking tools to repair fractures they'd thought were permanent. I stood at the podium Karen had set up, looking out at faces that carried variations of the pain I'd experienced, and spoke words I'd written and rewritten a dozen times the night before. This center exists because pain doesn't have to be the end of the story, I said, my voice steady despite the emotion pressing against my chest. My wife Helen believed in second chances, with a fierceness that sometimes frustrated me. She believed people could change, could grow, could become better than their worst moments. But she also understood something crucial. Second chances aren't about forgiving the people who hurt us. They're about becoming the people we were always capable of being despite the hurt. I paused, looking at Karen in the front row. This center bears her name because she would have wanted everyone here to know that transformation is possible, that dignity can be rebuilt, that you are not defined by what was done to you or even by what you've done. You're defined by what you choose to do next. The local newspaper ran a front-page story with a photo of Karen and me cutting a ribbon while that crowd of 50 people applauded behind us. Donations exceeded $200,000 in the first month, money that came in envelopes from across the country, often accompanied by handwritten notes about estranged parents or children who'd stolen, or families torn apart by greed, disguised as love. The center became something larger than my personal story, a place where pain could be transformed into purpose. On a Tuesday evening, 3 months after the opening, I was in the small office Karen had insisted I maintain at the center, reviewing budget reports when she knocked softly on my doorframe. "Bill, there's a man outside asking if he can help. He doesn't want recognition or thanks. He says he just wants to work." Something in her tone made me look up sharply. She continued carefully, "I think you should know, it's Ethan." I stood and moved to the window that overlooked the parking lot. My son stood beside a beat-up sedan I didn't recognize, wearing jeans and a plain t-shirt that hung loose on a frame that had lost weight. He looked older than his years, his posture carrying defeat but also something that might have been determination. Karen was already walking outside, and I watched their conversation through glass reading body language more than hearing words. Karen returned a few minutes later. "I told him we need someone to organize the supply closet and take out trash on Mondays and Thursdays. No pay, no press, no special treatment." She met my eyes. "He said thank you and starts next week." I watched Ethan from that window over the following months, observing him haul boxes of donated goods, sort through supplies, take out trash bags, and mop floors after evening sessions. We never spoke. Our paths were carefully choreographed to avoid direct intersection, though I suspected Karen's hand in that arrangement. But it was a beginning, the first tentative step towards something that might eventually resemble forgiveness, or at least coexistence. My own health began its slow, inevitable decline around this time. Nothing dramatic enough to alarm doctors or warrant hospitalization, just the gradual wearing down that comes with being 64 years old and carrying the weight of the previous 2 years. I tired more easily, needed afternoon naps, found myself winded after climbing stairs I'd once taken 2 at a time. My doctor, a forthright woman who'd cared for Helen during her final months, mentioned managing expectations and quality of life phrases that meant we were no longer talking about cure but about grace in decline. One evening in my workshop, surrounded by the model ships that marked decades of patient craftsmanship, I set up my laptop and pressed record. The light blinked red, and I looked into the camera as if I were looking at someone I'd never meet, someone who would watch this after I was gone. "If you're watching this, I'm gone," I began, my voice calm, perhaps calmer than I'd been in years. "But I want you to know something important. Revenge was never the point of what I did. The humiliation, the exposure, the systematic dismantling of their lies, none of that was about hurting them. It was about remembering who I was. Remembering that dignity isn't something given to you by others. It's chosen. Every single day, in every small decision we choose whether to live with integrity or compromise it for comfort. I chose to fight back not because I wanted them to suffer, but because I needed to prove to myself that I still existed, that I was still Bill Anderson, still the man Helen had loved, still capable of standing up when the world tried to push me down. I saved the video, scheduled it to upload 1 year from that day, and closed the laptop with a finality that felt appropriate. Through the workshop window, the sun set over Helen's rose garden, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. The roses had bloomed fuller this year than they had since she'd died, as if responding to the peace that had finally settled over the house. Peace had a face again, mine older but finally free. Autumn came again, marking a full year since I'd recorded that final video, since I'd sat in my workshop and spoken to an audience I'd never meet. The Helen Anderson Center had not just survived but flourished beyond anything Karen or I had imagined during those early planning sessions. The waiting list for counseling stretched 3 months long. The financial literacy classes filled within hours of being posted. Karen had hired 2 full-time counselors and 3 part-time administrators, transforming what had begun as a modest community project into something that resembled a small movement. Ethan still volunteered twice a week, arriving punctually every Monday and Thursday evening to handle the tasks no one else wanted. We'd never spoken directly, though. I'd watched him from various windows and doorways, observing the way he moved through the building with his head down, avoiding eye contact with other volunteers, doing his work with the grim determination of someone performing penance. Karen told me he'd asked about me once, wondered if I ever came by, but when she'd confirmed that I maintained an office there, he'd simply nodded and returned to sorting donated clothes. Rachel had vanished so completely that even Margaret's investigator had trouble tracking her movements. Rumors filtered through mutual acquaintances she'd moved to a small town in Oregon, was working as a waitress or maybe a bookkeeper, had changed her last name back to Carter, and deleted every trace of her social media presence. For a woman who'd built her identity on visibility, the disappearance felt like its own kind of death. Karen called me late on a Tuesday evening, her voice carrying a strange mixture of emotions I couldn't quite parse. "Bill, something happened tonight that I think you should know about." She paused, gathering words. I was closing up the center, turning off lights and locking doors when I noticed someone standing in the parking lot. Just standing there in the darkness, hood pulled up, hands in pockets. It was Rachel. My breath caught, though I'd known this moment would come eventually. "Did she try to come in?" "No," Karen said softly. She just stood there watching through the window. There was a women's support group meeting in the main room, and I could see her face in the light from inside. She was watching them laugh and share stories and help each other heal. I don't know what she was thinking, but her expression was something I'd never seen on her face before. Not performance, not calculation. Just someone looking at something they'd lost and maybe finally understanding what it had been worth. How long did she stay? Maybe 5 minutes. Then she turned and walked away. I didn't try to stop her. Karen was quiet for a moment. I think she came to see what she could have built instead of destroyed. I think she came to witness what happens when people choose differently than she did. That night alone in my house, where Helen's presence still lingered in the arrangement of furniture and the choice of curtains, my laptop pinged with a notification I'd set up a year ago and then half forgotten. The scheduled upload had executed exactly as programmed. Rachel's old YouTube channel, dormant for over a year, had just posted a new video at precisely midnight. The thumbnail showed me sitting in my garden during the golden hour, white hair catching sunlight like a halo I'd never claimed to deserve. The title read, "They mocked me live. I forgave them online." I clicked play, watching myself speak from a year ago, from a version of myself that had known this moment was coming but couldn't have predicted exactly how it would feel to witness it. "If you're watching this, I'm gone," my recorded voice said, steady and calm, the voice of a man who'd made peace with mortality and legacy. "But I'm not speaking to you from the grave. I'm speaking to you from peace, which is something entirely different. Peace is what I found after I stopped fighting, after I realized that revenge and justice are not the same thing, that destroying someone doesn't heal the wounds they inflicted, that the only way forward is through grace." I watched myself talk for 12 minutes about humiliation and dignity, about the difference between punishment and accountability, about realizing that the best revenge is becoming someone you're proud to be. The video ended with text appearing across the screen, white letters on black background. "All proceeds from this video will fund the Helen Anderson Center for Second Chances. For every parent who stayed silent too long, rebuild." Within 48 hours, the video had been viewed 8 million times. The comments section filled with thousands of voices, many sharing their own stories of family betrayal, of finding strength to fight back, of choosing grace over vengeance. The hashtag Dignity for Elders trended again, this time with a different tone, less about outrage and more about healing. National news outlets ran segments about the center, about the movement that had grown from one man's refusal to accept humiliation as his final chapter. Karen called me 3 days after the upload, barely able to speak through her tears of joy. "Bill, the National Family Foundation just called. They're offering $500,000 in grant funding. They said your video is the most powerful piece of advocacy they've seen in a decade." In a small apartment in a town I'd never visit, Rachel sat alone watching the video on her phone, her face illuminated by the screen's glow. According to Karen, who'd received a message from David's wife, Rachel had typed a comment, "I'm sorry," then deleted it, then typed it again and left it there. Among the thousands of other comments, one small admission of guilt in an ocean of praise. It would be lost, almost immediately buried under the volume of responses, but it existed, and perhaps that was enough. Ethan watched from his own apartment across town, and when the video ended, he picked up his phone and called my number, knowing the line had been disconnected months ago, but needing to hear the voicemail recording that still played. "You've reached Bill. Leave a message." After the beep, he whispered into the void, "I'm trying, Dad. I'm trying to be better than I was. I'm trying to build something instead of just taking. I don't know if you'd be proud, but I'm trying." In Oakwood Cemetery, on the gentle slope where Helen and I would eventually lie side by side, someone placed a fresh white rose on the grass above my future grave. The groundskeeper found it the next morning, a single flower with no card attached except a small piece of paper with one word written in a child's uncertain handwriting, "Grandpa." He didn't know who'd left it, couldn't say whether it was Mason, finally learning the truth and mourning the grandfather he'd pretended to have, or some other child touched by the story, or perhaps just someone who understood that certain words carry weight beyond biology. They mocked me live. I forgave them online. And in doing so, I became immortal. I stand in my workshop now, running my hands over the wood that will become my final project, a model ship I'll build slowly with no deadline except the ones our bodies impose. Helen's roses bloom outside the window, and somewhere across town, the center that bears her name opens its doors to people seeking the second chances she always believed we deserved. Ethan takes out trash on Thursday evenings, and Rachel watches from distant shadows, and Karen teaches women that poverty of spirit is worse than poverty of wallet. This is not an ending. It's a foundation carefully laid that will stand long after the architect is gone. If you've listened to my story this far, I have one request. Look around at your own family, your own relationships. Are there words left unspoken, dignity left undefended? We teach people how to treat us by what we're willing to accept. Don't wait until humiliation forces your hand. Build your boundaries now with love, if possible, with steel if necessary. Tell me in the comments, have you ever had to choose between family peace and self-respect? What did you choose, and would you choose differently now? Your stories matter. They're the next chapter in a book that never really ends. This is Bill Anderson, architect of homes, and in the end, architect of justice. Thank you for listening. Now go build something worth leaving behind.